I've always loved the sea. It's not that I'm a sailor or anything, but growing up around the coast means I've always felt close to it. My wife and I met for our first date at the beach in Rhodesia, and after we returned from teaching abroad in the 70s, we bought our very first house right by the sea in Wales. In that house, we raised 2 sons, 4 grandchildren, 5 dogs, and 1 stray cat, all over the span of 38 years. It's been a good life. I haven't regretted a minute of it. Not even as I watched my wife struggle with her chest, and not even when I fell asleep on the sofa and awoke to find her cold in her recliner. Losing her has been the biggest struggle of my entire life. I used to tell her that life wouldn't be worth living without her. It even occurred to me that I might have to face it. Doctors say that it was a clot in her lungs, which is a bitter irony. How many years did I smoke? God, it was most of my life, and I never once saw her even look at a cigarette. The doctor said it was nothing to do with that, but it's not really the point. The point is that I smoked and drank and ate poorly, and every morning she'd wake up early and do the same exercise tape for the best part of 25 years. We even kept a VHS player, just so she wouldn't have to get a new routine. Even now, it seems so absurd that she died first, and so young as well. I thought she lived to be 100, just like her mother, but life's funny like that. After her death, I've spent the last year battling a dark cloud in my mind. My sons have worked hard to keep my head above water, making sure I do simple things like eat and bathe. I lived in a kind of fugue state for the first few months, barely registering who I was speaking to or what I was doing. It wasn't until the girl that things changed for me. I was sitting on my bed. This was about 2 months after the funeral, when I heard a scream. It was about 1 a.m., I reckon. I didn't sleep much back then, but this scream, it was awful. It wasn't a panicked scream. No, it was like this agonized screeching, just a short burst of unspeakable agony. Before I even had time to process what had happened, I was limping out into my backyard with a robe on, shouting into the wind-whipped darkness. I remember walking up to the threshold of my yard, where it opens up onto a small bit of forestry before the sandy beach, and standing there, shivering and scared. I was so scared and confused, even as I shouted over and over, "Is anybody out there? Hello?" The only thing I ever saw that night were the trees lit up by my torch, looking like bright white sticks of chalk against a blackboard. I kept telling myself that it was just a fox, but I knew damn well what a fox sounded like, and it wasn't that. The next day, as soon as the sun rose, I went looking, walking through the woods until I made it down onto the open beach. With the tides just pulling in, and the wet sand reflecting the low winter sun, it felt like standing on a plane of glass that stank of salt and decay. I quickly found a small fire pit, close to the trees and far from the water. It's not uncommon for teenagers to come and drink and smoke around here, so I figured that maybe some kids had been hanging around that night. The only other thing around was some dead crabs, bits of driftwood, and a braying tangle of seagulls. At first I ignored them, but as I continued to scan the horizon, I glimpsed a flash of color between their flapping wings. I hurried over and kicked them all away. They'd been fighting over her. It was awful. I knew instantly it was the person who'd screamed. She couldn't have been much older than 13, I reckon. Although the police won't say for sure because they're still not sure who she actually is. It's just something about the backpack. It looked the sort of thing a younger girl might have. She was probably invited along by an older boy and snuck out without her parents knowing. They do it all the time. Hell, I did. Sometimes, when I have nightmares, I still see that seaweed-covered pile of ribbon-like flesh. My eldest son gave me a bit of a row for going down there on my own, but the police thanked me for calling them. For weeks afterwards, the girl's death haunted me. I couldn't stop thinking about it. I couldn't get it out of my head. I called the police every day for a week, hoping to hear some updates, but they never gave me anything. It's not that I was hoping for good news. I knew better than to expect good news. But some answers, maybe. I hoped to find some answers, and yet nothing ever came. At least not from there. What I did then was to start waiting in my backyard each night. I kind of hoped I might see something. A part of me, deep down, deep down, I hoped I might even be able to stop whatever had hurt her and martyr myself in the process. After a few weeks of nothing but wind, I started walking the beach each morning, worried I might find another victim. I felt like I was the only one who even really cared. I know that's not true, but in that house, all on my own, I felt like I was the only one even trying to stop it happening again. It was during one of those walks I first saw the line. I didn't recognize it for what it was, no. It just looked like seaweed. A plump piece of seaweed that lay on the wet sand shore like half-chewed licorice, while a black stalk as thick as my wrist ran all the way into the sea. I stared at it for a bit, horrified by the smell and way it seemed to writhe and bubble in open air. I thought it might have been some strange, unseen animal. I was set to ignore it, but something about the pustule-covered oily surface piqued my curiosity so badly that I grabbed a nearby stick and poked it. I wasn't prepared for what happened next. I don't think anyone could be. The mass just disappeared. At first, I heard a loud twang and then a splash. Then I felt a breeze around my face. And then I was just looking at a crater in the sand. But I cannot emphasize just how quick this thing was. By the time my brain had even registered the thing's absence, it was long gone. I didn't even see it move. It just disappeared. It was like someone had edited a camera to make it disappear from one frame to the next. At first, I sort of just suppressed the strange experience. I thought it was unrelated to everything, and I wasn't in a very good place mentally, so I just sort of forgot it. I was still hoping I might find out what happened to that girl, and as far as I was concerned, that thing was probably just a weird fish. Except, the next day, I went for my morning walk, and it was back. This time, there were some feathers sticking out of it. Up close to it, I saw the mangled, half-alive body of a seagull. It looked awful. The bird was squawking over and over, and the brutal half-broken flapping of its wings made a terrible racket. I didn't know exactly what had happened to it. I suspected it might have become trapped, maybe when it was looking for some food. I've always had a policy of being kind to animals, so I bent down to pull it out, and there was the sound of something going taut, the thronging of a rope, and then a crack, and then a whoosh, and then I was looking at nothing. It was so utterly bizarre and shocking. I didn't even react at first. I just stood there, trying to process what I'd seen. I decided afterwards that maybe it wasn't so good for me to go walking to the beach during the morning. I half suspected I was going a bit mad. A few weeks passed. After that, the girl was what occupied my mind during that time. I was happy to have a distraction from the death of my wife, and in some ways I thought that by worrying over this poor dead child, I was doing something nobler than just looking after myself. It remained like that for quite some time until one day I woke up and looked outside to find my bins thrown around the garden. This sort of thing can happen now and again, of course, what with foxes being quite common. But foxes don't normally move the heavy wheelie bins. It would have been a struggle for me to drag them that far, let alone an animal. Going downstairs, I saw all my rubbish thrown around, and initially my heart sank at the thought of having to clean it up. But as I approached one bin that had snagged on a bush, I suddenly noticed that it wasn't actually a bin at all. It was the seaweed, again. The way the plastic rubbish was dotted around and through it, and the way it looked so shiny and strange. Well, it looked very much like a bin bag. It was convincing, and that's what made me stop. That's what made me scared. There was even a clump of black seaweed at the very top, shaped just like a little knot. Exactly the kind of knot you'd tie at the top of a bin bag. And the way it was nestled in the bush meant that you had to look quite hard to see the twisted stalks trailing off into the woods. I couldn't understand it. It was terrifying because nothing was making any sense. But I was pretty sure that this thing, whatever it was, well, it was trying to trick me. And not just in the way that a moth might trick a spider with camouflage. No, this felt like a very clever trick. For a moment, I actually reached down, ready to give it a quick poke and see what happened, when I heard a creak. It sounded like rope under tension, or wood being stood on. It sounded like something winding up in anticipation. I hesitated, and then just decided to leave it alone and back away. Something about the thing changed when I stopped bending down and moved away. It suddenly began to throb. It looked a little bit like it had been holding its breath to stay still. By the time I'd walked up to the stairs, I'd looked out the window and saw that it was already gone. It was a few days before I saw it again. Enough time passed that I'd managed to try and forget at least a little bit of it had happened. I'd spent all day watching TV, just like I do every day, and then fallen asleep in the living room chair. When I woke up, the window was open and the lights were off. I could feel the draft. It felt sharp and cold, and my knees ached from where the blanket had slid down onto the floor. I wiped my face of drool and checked my watch, seeing that it was 2 a.m. I was groggy at this stage, thinking that it was a little unusual that I'd turned the lights off. Still, my wife had always kept a lamp beside her chair to help her read, and I reached over to turn it on when I heard a subtle creak. I froze and looked across. It was there. It was smaller this time, probably to help it fit through the window, but it was there. It was bunched around the lamp, steady and waiting. If it wasn't for the moonlight pouring in through the living room window, I would never have seen it. That slick, black flesh disappeared utterly into shadow. Looking around, I saw the twisted black stalk, as thick as my arm, trailing across my living room floor and up through the open window. I stood up, shaking with fear, and I went and turned the light on, noticing the strange black-purple residue that was left on the switch. That same residue now soaked the carpet, filling my living room with the stench of rotting fish and strange, salty air. Once again, that strange mass had started throbbing once I moved away, looking like it had relaxed its dreadful ruse. I grabbed a nearby newspaper, and in anger I walked over and hid it. I don't know exactly what I expected, but the speed of the thing. The living room window was practically torn out of the wall. The air rushed in as if displaced from an explosion, and my rug had friction burns. Actual burns, charred into the fiber from where this thing had moved so fast. It had damn near ignited the nylon, and the newspaper I'd held, it had been snatched out of my hand so fast my skin was left bloodied and my wrist was sore for days. But what worried me the most, even in the moment, was the sense that it had actively tried to grab me. My eyes had barely registered it, but I swore I saw that thing clamp onto the paper with phlegmy tendrils. If it wasn't for the fact that I'd used a random object, it would have succeeded. After that, I couldn't get the idea out of my head it was a lure. It was a goddamn fishing lure. It was smart, sophisticated fishing lure, and it was trying to drag me into the damn sea. What the hell for? I couldn't imagine. But I had a good guess that when it was done with me, it wouldn't be throwing me back. I became paranoid pretty quickly. I started carrying a flashlight with me at all times, and I never left any windows open. But there was this horrible sense. You see, I knew nothing about this thing, but it had known enough about me to switch off the light and then set the lamp up as a lure. I started double-checking every little thing. Would it rig the toilet paper for one of my many midnight bathroom trips? Would it rig the very rug I walked on to get to the lights? What about my bed? My pillows? My clothes? How often do you wake up groggy-eyed and barely sentient and shamble into your morning routine? It wasn't just the fear. It was the false positives. It was the way I'd scold myself if I grabbed something without looking. It was the way I'd live in constant fear of messing up all over again. I made sure I knew just how much luck had saved my skin up until that point, and I kept telling myself my luck would not hold out much longer. That's not a healthy way to live, by the way. It's actually quite exhausting. I just kept hoping it would somehow end, and as the weeks passed, I started to hope that maybe the lure had left me alone, finding me a little too smart. Looking back, that's quite a laughable idea. If anything, I had drastically underestimated the lure. You see, I'd always had a fondness for cats. My wife had preferred dogs, and while I love all animals, I'd grown up with cats and I liked their company a lot, and secretly I'd always wished we could have had more. It was late one night when I heard a strange meow coming from just beyond my window. It was a stormy night, and you could hear the sea battering the distant cliffs. I ignored it at first, because it's so typical for cats around here to fight and cry. But the sound kept coming. Sitting there, listening to this creature in pain, I couldn't help but to get to thinking. Wouldn't it be nice if I had a cat in my old age? I could find one and help it, and call the vets in the morning, and then the cat would maybe stick around. I had images of a little ginger tabby cat sauntering around the kitchen as I pottered about. God, I was being so stupid. I rushed outside and followed the noise. It was almost regular, like a church organ. When I traced it, I found a cat's back end sticking out of a bush. It looked like it was struggling, almost like it had become stuck. I was so wound up, so broken from the lack of sleep and distressed by the sound of pain, that I came so close, mere inches away from touching the orange fur. But something within me told me otherwise. In the moment, I hated it. I hated that thought. I so badly wanted to help another living thing that I secretly loathed this part of me that suggested that maybe, just maybe, it was all a part of the lure. I took a deep breath and pulled back the bushes, and what I saw horrified me. It hadn't even found a living cat, or if it had, it certainly hadn't let it live for long. You see, this thing, this amorphous tendril-wielding lump of tobacco spit come to life, had driven long-knuckled fingers that looked like grotesque spider legs deep into the belly of this cat. Before my very eyes, I saw those fingers spread the cat's ribs and then squeeze them shut, pushing a withering and unnatural cry out of the animal's mouth as it did so. It was like some twisted, hellish version of a bagpipe. I fell backwards and screamed. The very sight made me want to vomit. I couldn't bear it. I was so angry. I wanted to grab that damn lure and yank whatever the hell was in that ocean out to meet me and face my wrath. It took every ounce of my willpower to stop myself. That's what made it so clever. It knew. It knew exactly how to push my buttons. It wasn't about tricking me that time. It was about goading me. It took every bit of strength to hold myself back, but in anger, I stood and screamed at it. "Go away! Just fuck off and leave me alone!" With that, the cat's body suddenly slumped and fell down. When I looked in the bush once more, there was no sign of the lure. It had gone, leaving me with the poor animal's body. I buried it that night, sobbing the whole time. The next morning, I called my son and asked him to take me to a home, one that's far away from the sea. Since then, I've just been waiting. I've been ready to go for days. I don't want to take anything with me. It hurts just to look at it now. All I wanted to do was leave. I thought that maybe if I got far away, but like always, I'd just keep underestimating the lure. I thought that my son would be coming this morning. He was supposed to. He rang at midday, a good few hours after he was expected. He was hysterical. He kept saying no one could understand why. No one knew why. Why what? I'd asked. Why they dig her up, Dad? Why would anyone take her body? And now it's nighttime. It's night and my head is hurting and I'm afraid. I'm afraid of what's upstairs. I'm afraid of the sound of smashing glass that I heard an hour ago, and the strange and dreadful thumping that followed it. I'm most afraid because when I went upstairs to check on what had happened, nothing looked different. It was the most normal thing in the world, a sight I've seen 1,000 times. My bedroom, the lampshade on, my slippers ready, and worst of all, the duvet-covered shape of my wife, her chest rising and falling. Alzheimer's disease is one of the most insidious ways to watch a loved one die. It is never a slow, steady decline into madness that one could prepare for. There were moments of lucidity that were so poignant that it would be impossible to think that they would not slip any further, only to have that hope dashed in an instant when they forgot who you were or called a relative who was long deceased. I was always close with my grandparents, who took me in when I was 6. My mom had passed away from cancer, and my dad had succumbed to an addiction problem shortly thereafter. I don't really remember my mom being sick, and that was probably for the best. I always recalled her beautiful brown eyes and how soothing her voice was to me. She showered me with affection and always felt safe and loved around her. My father was another matter entirely. He was rarely around, and I had only a couple of memories of him. But what stuck with me was that I had always got very queasy anytime the memory struck. He had piercing blue eyes and a voice that bellowed so strongly that I couldn't help but feel threatened by him. He was apparently from a family with a lot of money, as I was provided a good life that was above the means that my grandparents could have afforded on their blue-collar jobs. I grew up happy and healthy and didn't question anything until my mid-20s after the death of my grandpa. I decided to move back home to help out my grandma. It was about the same commute to my office as a consultant, and I knew it bothered my grandma to stay alone in the house. After some light resistance, she reluctantly agreed to have me stay. Within the first couple weeks of my return home, I noticed that there was something odd about her grieving. Several times I heard her say, "He can't do this," in between sobs. And when I went to console her, she clutched a picture of my parents. If I ever attempted to take the frame from her, she'd shriek like a wounded animal and beg me to give her space. Each and every time I obliged, and she would return to her gregarious self upon seeing me again. Not long after, she began to behave more erratically. She essentially became nocturnal, sleeping throughout the day and wandering around the house at night, usually doing chores and finding things for me to work on during the weekends. I'd awake to find drawers open and their contents dumped on the floor, lights on in every room except the study, and random objects moved a couple of inches to the left. Not knowing what to do, I brought her to a neurologist who delivered the bad news of Alzheimer's disease and told me to hire a nurse or consider moving her to a facility. I decided to go with a nurse, and things seemed to stabilize for a bit. She was forgetful and sometimes thought I was my grandfather. We were both named Stephen, but she always called me Stevie. It was hard at times, and seeing a once proud woman having to be reminded of who the people she loved were was tragic. After a particularly bad day, I took a couple of Benadryl before bed, hoping to sleep through the night. I was basically in a coma until I heard an unmistakable bang, glass shattering, and screaming. I sprinted towards my grandma's bedroom and was terrified at the sight of her covered in blood. I gasped at seeing her hand trembling with the pistol, her eyes wide in terror, pointing at the mirror she had clearly just shot at. Thankfully, the bleeding was from the glass cutting her and not from a gunshot wound, and I darted to the bathroom after taking the gun. Much to my astonishment, it didn't even register to her that I was there or that she had just injured herself. She just kept staring directly into the shattered mirror and repeated, "Stephen, what do we do now? He knows," and kept raising her voice, anticipating a response that was never coming. I immediately called 911 and followed the paramedics to the hospital, perturbed at the events that had just unfolded. Even though I wanted to respect her wishes and had the means to care for her, I knew that she was a danger to herself and potentially others, and could no longer stay at home. I was devastated as she called into the hallway to ask to speak to me, hoping to keep my emotions in check for the night. Her gaze narrowed as I pulled up a chair and sat beside her. I grabbed her hands, clammy and wrinkled with age, and asked her how she was feeling. She sat up suddenly and in a stern tone said, "Stevie, what I am about to tell you is something that your grandfather and I never intended for you to know. We tried our whole lives to shield you from everything, but unfortunately my time is running out and you need to know the truth." She continued, "The circumstances in which you came to us were much different than what you were told. Your parents had a wonderful marriage, living a life of luxury and travel most could only dream about. You were born a beautiful, healthy boy, and there was no doubt that you were going to be loved and cherished by them. They moved to England for a time, and naturally, communication wasn't as consistent as when they lived here, but we weren't concerned at first. You were her bundle of joy, and were ecstatic when she agreed to come home for a visit with you. When we saw her, we were equally enamored with you as we were mortified with how your mother looked. She had gained weight to more than double her size, and her tan skin was almost a pasty white. She refused to even hug us because she had strict orders from your father to never risk being bruised. She kept droning on about her sacrifices and left abruptly with you in the middle of the night after receiving a phone call from your father. This didn't sit well with us, and we tried to find out where they lived in England for a surprise visit. It was remarkably difficult to track them down, and we were heartbroken over the prospect that the two of you could potentially be in trouble and not help. We spent every dime we could to find you, and eventually got a tip that your father's family had property in the States. We set out immediately to the house, hoping to find out your whereabouts, but nothing could prepare us for what we saw. I instinctively slumped in my chair, perplexed. There was no way this could be a deranged rambling, but it was just too much to believe. Could she really have kept a secret like this from me? And why? My grandmother squeezed my hand and continued. The address led us to a mansion surrounded by woods on all sides and perched on top of a hill. We were greeted by a British butler who asked to see our invitations. We bluntly told him who we were and demanded to see you or someone in the family who could tell us where you were, and we would not budge until we were sure of your well-being. The butler calmly excused himself and said that the master of the house would arrive shortly to answer all our inquiries and invited us inside. I was shocked to see your father in the doorway, beaming from ear to ear like this guest of honor had arrived. "Dorothy, Stephen, what a wonderful surprise. So glad you could make it." Your grandfather was irate and demanded to see you and your mother, or else there'd be hell to pay. Stephen went on berating your father for another minute before that scumbag interrupted, yelling, "Enough!" so loudly the room seemed to shake. "Please, have a drink, and I will provide you with everything you need to know, and you will be able to see both Christina and Stevie tonight." As he walked to the bar to prepare a couple drinks. I was elated at the news, but confused by the deliberate break in communication. Was the silence from our daughter involuntary, or had we done something that upset her? Your dad took a puff on his cigar while handing us a drink, and exclaimed after he blew out a ring of smoke, "I am so excited for you to witness this. Your grandson is more special than you could ever imagine." I was unsettled, but your grandfather pressed for more information. "For generations, the royal families from all over the world have had a special ritual that helps bring us all closer and ensures that we solidify our power. We never know who gets picked and from where, which means that the chosen ones can hail from anywhere. Each generation brings a different number of chosen children who actually rule the world, and they, in turn, must seek out the right sacrifice to beget more chosen children. This has progressed for centuries, with the chosen leading regardless of titles and who held the crown of a king or a queen. Now, your grandson is the only chosen in this generation. This has never happened since the pact began, making him the chosen of chosens. Let us join the feast and celebrate." We were led into the great dining hall that had people from all over the world, and all were staring at the stage on the far end of the room. There, your mother held you and looked down lovingly at you and was cooing and speaking softly. Stephen instinctively screamed, "Carolyn!" At the exact moment, a dark shadow began to envelop you two. All the guests began chanting in a language I couldn't recognize, and all the lights went dark to the point where you couldn't see anything. The only visible light came from the pair of red eyes from the stage, which grew wider and larger as the chanting accelerated. And then the chanting turned into a deafening screech that knocked me off my feet. When I came to, all the people had vanished with only their robes remaining. The only other person left was you, completely covered in blood. To this day, we don't know what happened, but there was a box that was by your side and a tiny little key. As we approached you, a guttural voice exclaimed that the boy must open it when the time is right. The location of the box and key is scribbled on the back of the picture of your parents that I love. You must find it before they do. As she finished, she took a deep breath and closed her eyes. I sat with my mouth wide open as she passed on, not knowing